There is a city resting quietly on the banks of a wide, slow river, and for a little while, there is nowhere else to be. The year is somewhere in the early part of the 14th century, and the city is Paris, and it is almost entirely still. Let everything else go soft around the edges now. There is only this, a cool hour before dawn, a river moving in the dark, and the long, easy weight of a city in deep sleep. Paris in this century holds perhaps 200,000 souls, making it one of the largest cities in all of Europe. But right now, in the hour before the bells begin, before the bakers pull the first loaves from their ovens, before the river traders pole their flat-bottomed boats toward the market landings, right now, the city is quieter than it will be at any other moment of the day. And that quiet is worth settling into. The sky above Paris is not yet light. It is that particular shade of darkness that comes just before dawn, when the black of true night has softened into something closer to deep blue, or the color of old pewter, or the inside of a closed eye. The stars are still there, faintly, though the ones near the horizon have already dimmed to almost nothing. And along the eastern edge of the sky, somewhere above the low hills and the fields and the orchards that begin just beyond the city walls, there is the very first suggestion, not yet a color, not quite a glow, of the coming day. The Seine moves below, slow and wide, and carrying with it the coolness of all the miles it has already traveled. The river runs through the heart of Paris, dividing it, and on a calm morning like this one, the water is very dark and very smooth in places, disturbed only by the quiet eddies that form along the stone piers of the bridges and along the wooden stakes of the fish traps set close to the banks. There are several bridges crossing the Seine in this period, and they are not empty structures. They are living things, lined with houses and shops built right out over the water, their timber frames extending over the river on heavy wooden brackets. These buildings are dark and shuttered now. Their upper windows face the sky, and below them the water moves past in the dark without hurry. From somewhere near the middle of the city, from the long island in the river that the people of Paris call the Isle de la Cité, the towers of Notre Dame rise against the paling sky. The cathedral is not yet finished. It will not be entirely finished for some years still. But its great bulk is already there, its twin square towers standing up into the dark, its long nave stretching back from the west front toward the east end, and the high choir behind the altar. In this quiet hour, it is simply a shape against the sky. And what a shape it is, solid and immense and utterly patient, as though it has been there forever and intends to remain there forever, which for all practical purposes it has and will. The smell of the river reaches everywhere in this part of the city. It is not an unpleasant smell in the early morning, before the day's activity stirs up whatever the city has deposited into the water. Right now, it is the smell of cool water and wet stone, and something faintly green and organic, the smell of a living river in an old city. The stone walls of the buildings close to the water are always damp at their lower courses, furred with a thin growth of moss in the shadowed places, darkened by decades of river air. If a hand were placed against one of those stones, the cold of it would travel inward immediately and completely. The streets of Paris in this era are mostly narrow, and most of them are not paved, though the main thoroughfares have been given a covering of stone in the years since King Philip Augustus ordered the paving of the principal roads in the previous century. In the narrower lanes between the tall timber houses, the ground underfoot is compacted earth and straw, and the accumulated residue of daily life, and in the night hours it dries out and grows still, and gives off its own particular quiet smell, dusty and animal and old. No one is walking those streets right now. The city has pulled its people indoors for the night, and those people are asleep. Sleep in the medieval world tends to come in two parts, which the people of this time consider entirely natural. There's a first sleep, which comes on with darkness and lasts for several hours, and then a waking period in the middle of the night, which might last an hour or more, and which is used for quiet conversation, for prayer, for attending to small tasks by candlelight, and sometimes simply for lying still in the warmth of the bed and letting the mind move where it wishes. After this wakeful interval comes the second sleep, which carries the sleeper through to morning. Right now, in this last dark hour before dawn, most of Paris is deep in that second sleep, heavy and still, and breathing slowly in the warmth of their beds and their sleeping rooms. The beds of this time are not the solitary things of later centuries. Families sleep together in the same room, often in the same bed, piled under layers of wool and linen according to the season. In the more prosperous households, there are proper bed frames of carved oak, with thick straw mattresses covered in linen, and hangings of heavy cloth drawn around the bed to keep the warmth in. In humbler rooms, people sleep on straw pallets laid on the floor, wrapped in whatever coverings they own, bodies pressed together for warmth through the long winter months. But now it is a mild season, and the warmth is easy, and sleep has come without difficulty. Above the sleeping city, the sky continues its slow change. The blue-black of the middle of the night has shifted now into something lighter, something that carries within it the possibility of gray. The stars near the horizon have faded entirely. The towers of Notre Dame are beginning to have a little more definition against the sky, their stone surfaces just barely distinguishable from the air around them. This is the earliest edge of dawn, not the dawn itself, which still has some time to arrive, but the first announcement of its coming, the gentlest possible signal that the night is ending. Along the river, the water continues to move. A single duck crosses a still patch of water near the south bank, leaving behind it a pair of ripples that spread and widen, and eventually lose themselves against the stone base of the embankment. A heron stands perfectly still on a wooden stake near the mouth of one of the small tributary streams that feed into the Seine, waiting with the infinite patience of herons for a fish to come within reach. The heron has been there for some time. It may have been there for hours. It does not seem to notice the slow arrival of the light. On the Isle de la Cité, a single lamp is burning inside the cathedral. It is the lamp that burns always before the altar, kept alight through the night by the canons who maintain it, one of the duties of that great institution. Its light does not show from outside. The windows are dark, the doors are shut, but it is there, a small, steady flame in the enormous interior space, burning in the dark among all that stone and silence. The silence is real silence now. In a few hours, Paris will be one of the loudest cities imaginable, a city of shouting vendors, ringing church bells, clattering cartwheels, arguing merchants, crying children, hammering metalworkers, and the general accumulated roar of 200,000 people going about their lives in a very small space. But that is later. That is the day. The day has not yet begun. For now there is only the river, and the pale sky, and the stone towers rising against it, and somewhere in the city a dog that has just begun to bark at something, and then thought better of it, and gone quiet again. There is the smell of cool water. There is the sound of the current moving softly against the wooden piers beneath the bridges. There is the long, unbroken sleep of almost everyone in the city, rising and falling in the dark like something breathing. Paris rests. The Seine moves. The sky lightens very slowly by the smallest possible degrees, and there is nothing at all that needs doing right now, nothing that needs watching or thinking or following. There is only this hour, this particular hour that belongs to no one and nothing, the hour between the last of the night and the first of the morning, when the city is more itself than it is at any other time, old and quiet and patient and entirely at ease. Rest here for a little while. The city is not going anywhere. The morning will come in its own time, gently and without hurry, the way mornings always do. Somewhere across the rooftops, a bell begins to sound. It is not a dramatic sound. It does not ring out sharp and urgent the way a bell might in a moment of alarm. It rises slowly, as bells do in the early morning, each tone full and rounded, fading before the next one comes. This is the bell of a small parish church, one of perhaps 30 or 40 parish churches within the city walls of Paris, and it is calling the hour of prime, the first prayer of the canonical day, the moment when the night is considered, officially, to have ended. The bell sounds once, and then again, and the sound moves through the cold air above the rooftops and down through the narrow streets below, where it softens against the stone and the timber and disappears. The city does not leap awake. It shifts almost imperceptibly, like a person turning in sleep. A shutter loosens somewhere. A dog stirs in a doorway. And somewhere below the level of sound, beneath notice, the day has quietly begun. The bakers have not been sleeping. They have been working for hours already, in the darkness, in the warmth of their bakehouses, while the rest of the city lay still. This was the ordinary shape of a baker's life in medieval Paris, governed not only by habit, but by rule. The Bakers' Guild and the city's own ordinances had a great deal to say about when bread could be made, how it should be made, what weight a loaf ought to be, and what price it could be sold for. The bread trade in a city like Paris was not a casual thing. It fed tens of thousands of people, and those people depended on it in a very direct and daily way. And so the bakers had risen in the deep middle of the night, had lit their fires, had begun the long, slow work of making bread. The bakehouse is a low-ceilinged room, warm from the oven that takes up a good portion of one wall. The oven itself is a heavy thing of brick and stone, with a wide mouth and a vaulted interior where the heat collects and spreads evenly. Hours earlier, the baker or his apprentice would have packed the oven with wood, oak, perhaps, or whatever good hardwood was available, and set it burning, and waited while the fire worked its way through the fuel and the bricks absorbed the heat. In a properly tended bread oven, the fire eventually burns down to coals and ash, and those coals are raked out or pushed to the sides, and the baking surface, the floor of the oven, holds onto the heat in a deep and steady way. It is this heat, not the flame, but the stored warmth in the stone, that bakes the bread. A long-handled wooden tool called a peel is used to slide the shaped loaves into the oven. It is a simple instrument, flat and broad at one end, the handle extending far enough that the baker can reach deep into the oven without putting his hands near the heat. The loaves go in one at a time, or several at once if the oven is wide enough, and then the baker draws the peel back, and the mouth of the oven is sealed again, and there is nothing to do but wait. There is a particular quality to the waiting that happens in a bakehouse. It is not an anxious waiting. The baker knows his oven. He has worked it for years, or his master before him worked it, and the knowledge of how long the bread needs, how to tell when the crust has taken color without opening the oven unnecessarily, when to begin the next batch. All of this has settled into something like instinct, or at least into deep familiarity. The room is warm. The fire is low now, the active burning long past, the oven doing its quiet work. Perhaps there is a tallow candle or a small oil lamp giving a dim, steady light. Perhaps a boy is sleeping in the corner, an apprentice who will be useful later when the loaves come out and need to be arranged, when customers begin to arrive. The smell of baking bread fills the room slowly, the way warmth fills a room, spreading from the oven outward, rising toward the low ceiling, thick and yeasty and sweet in a gentle way. It is one of the oldest and most uncomplicated smells in the world. There is nothing sharp about it, nothing that demands attention. It simply arrives and settles and makes the room feel more complete. In 14th-century Paris, bread was not all the same. The finest bread, white bread, made from flour that had been carefully bolted to remove the bran, was expensive, and it was eaten by those who could afford it. Lower down the scale were loaves made from coarser flour, darker in color, heavier in texture, less delicate in flavor, but nourishing in their own way. And there were mixed breads, breads made partly of wheat and partly of rye or other grains, breads suited to ordinary people living ordinary lives. The pain de Chailly and the pain de Bourgeois were names associated with different grades of Parisian bread, reflecting the gradations of a city where what you ate said something about who you were and where you stood. But even the coarser loaves were made with care. A baker whose bread was found to be underweight, or poorly made, or sold at the wrong price, could face real consequences, fines, or worse, a public humiliation involving a sled and a tour of the streets, the offending loaf tied around his neck. The guild and the city's officials took these things seriously, and so the bakers worked carefully, in the dark and the warmth, shaping their loaves with hands that knew exactly what was needed. The first loaves come out of the oven golden, not bright gold, a quieter color than that, warm and uneven, the crust a little darker in places where the heat was strongest, lighter where the loaves were closer to the edges of the oven floor. The baker uses the peel to draw them out one by one and sets them on a board or a shelf to cool slightly. They make a faint crackling sound as the crust contracts in the cooler air of the room. There's no hurry to this moment. The loaves simply sit there, warm and finished, smelling of everything good that bread can smell of. The baker might tap one on its base to listen for the hollow sound that means the inside is baked through. He might run his eye along the row of them, checking their color, checking their shape. And then he might go back to his work, because there are more loaves to go in, more batches to move through the oven before the morning is fully underway. By the time the bell of that small parish church has finished sounding prime, the smell of fresh bread has begun to move through the streets. It does not travel far at first. The bakehouse doors are still closed or only slightly open, but the warm air finds its way out through gaps in the shutters, through the spaces around door frames, and it drifts into the street and mixes with the cool, damp air that has settled there overnight. Someone passing close to the bakehouse, a water carrier on an early errand, a monk walking to a nearby chapel, might catch it for a moment and then walk on. The street itself is still mostly quiet. The sky above the rooftops is beginning, very slowly, to lighten at its edges, the deep gray of near dawn becoming something slightly warmer, slightly more like the blue that will eventually come. There are no colors yet in the world outside. Everything is still in the range of gray and dark, stone and shadow, the pale glimmer of the river somewhere beyond the buildings to the south. But the bread is warm. The ovens are still holding their heat, and the first of the day's work is done. In the bakehouse, the apprentice in the corner has woken without drama, sitting up slowly and rubbing his face, and the baker has handed him something to do, a small task, arranging loaves, sweeping ash, something simple and useful. They do not speak much. There is no need to. The work knows itself, and they know the work, and the morning is still early enough that quiet feels right. The candle burns on, small and steady. The oven breathes its heat into the room. Outside, the bell has long since fallen silent, and the sky continues its slow, unhurried brightening. The way skies have always brightened, the same over Paris as over anywhere, the light coming not all at once, but gently, by degrees, as if the morning itself is in no particular rush to arrive. The Seine had been moving all night. It moved the way it always moved in those long ago centuries, slowly dark, carrying the cold of the hills and the forests far to the south and east, carrying the memory of rain that had fallen weeks before on distant slopes and found its way in time to this wide curve of river running through the heart of the city. The water was never still, even in the quietest hours before any boat appeared. The current kept its gentle, unhurried conversation with the stone pilings of the bridges, the soft lapping against the wooden quays, the low murmur that the river made simply by being itself. And then, in the gray time just after first light had begun to soften the sky, the boats came. They came from upstream, riding the current with the ease of long practice. Flat-bottomed boats, broad and low in the water, built not for speed, but for carrying, built to hold the weight of barrels and bales and sacks without complaint, to sit steady on the river, no matter how the cargo shifted. These were working boats, and they looked it. Their wood was dark with use and river water, their sides stained by the things they had carried across many seasons. They had no elegance to speak of. They had something better than elegance. They had purpose. The men who guided them stood at their poles or their oars with the unhurried attention of people who have done a thing so many times that the body simply knows what to do. A slight lean here, a gentle correction there. The current did most of the work. The boats settled into their approach almost on their own, drawn toward the quays at the Grand Pont, as if the river itself knew the way. The Grand Pont in those days was not merely a bridge. It was a place of commerce, a wide stone span lined with the small wooden stalls and shops of money changers and goldsmiths, a crossing point that also served as a marketplace hanging above the water. Below and beside it, along the banks, the stone quays descended in broad, shallow steps to the river's edge. And it was here that the unloading happened, here that the goods of the river trade came ashore into the city morning after morning, season after season, year after year. The wine came first, or at least the wine was what drew the eye. The barrels were large and round-bellied, made from the oak of forests that still stood then in the regions to the south and east. They had been filled in the vineyards around Burgundy and Champagne and further south still, the grapes of late summer pressed and sealed away through the autumn, and now traveling north to Paris, to the city that consumed so much of what the surrounding countryside could produce. Rolling a barrel was slow work. Getting it off a flat-bottomed boat without losing it to the river required patience and care. And the men who did it worked without hurry, bracing themselves against the wet stone, finding their footing, easing each barrel up the slope of the quay. There was a guild for all of this. The water merchants of Paris, the marchands de Elo, held rights over the river trade, that went back further than most people could remember or say precisely. Their guild was old in the way that certain things in medieval cities were old. Old not merely in years, but in the layers of custom and precedent and privilege that had settled around it like sediment. They had their seals and their rules, their officers and their meeting places, their agreements about who could unload what and where and when. The guild was proud of itself in the quiet, assured way of institutions that have survived long enough to feel permanent. A merchant who wanted to bring goods upriver and sell them in Paris had to navigate these ancient rites. The city was not simply open to whoever arrived at the quay with a boatload of wine. There were dues to pay, formalities to observe, the proper acknowledgments to make. And in exchange for all of this, there was order, a kind of slow, reliable order that meant the boats kept coming, and the city kept receiving what it needed. The firewood came alongside the wine, bundles of it, tied with rough rope, cut from the managed woodlands outside the city. Paris in winter consumed wood the way it consumed grain, steadily, without pause, in great quantities. Every bakehouse fire, every hearth in every house that had a hearth, every brazier in every workshop added to the demand. The forests around the city had been managed for this purpose for generations. Particular sections cut in rotation, given time to regrow before being cut again. The wood arrived on the river because the river was the easiest road, the road that required no horses and no carts and no maintenance beyond keeping the boats sound. The grain sacks were heavier than they looked. They always were. A sack of grain has a way of settling its weight downward in a way that seems to resist being lifted, and the men who carried them from boat to quay did so with the steady, measured steps of people who have learned not to fight the weight, but simply to carry it. The farms that sent this grain lay outside the city walls. The Ile-de-France was productive land, and the villages and small holdings scattered across it fed Paris in an almost constant stream of supply. The grain would go to mills, to bakers, to the household stores of those who could afford to lay in a supply. For now it sat in its sacks on the wet stone of the quay, darkening at the bottom where the stone was still damp from the river. The sky, through all of this, was going through its slow morning transformation. The gray that had covered everything at first light was brightening by degrees, the darkness receding not in any sudden way, but simply fading as light accumulated somewhere beyond the eastern rooflines. The city's smoke was beginning to rise, thin threads of it from the bakehouses, from the first domestic fires being coaxed to life in the rooms above streets that were only now starting to receive their first walkers. The river reflected what light there was in long, broken ripples, shifting and resettling. The men on the quay worked in something close to silence, or near enough to it. There were words exchanged, a direction, a question about where a particular barrel was meant to go, the low sounds of effort and acknowledgement, but it was not loud work. The river itself provided a kind of sound bed beneath everything, the water moving against stone and wood, the creak of the boats as they settled and shifted with the current. A gull made its way overhead without urgency. More boats were arriving now. The quay was filling in the deliberate way that quays fill in the early morning, each new arrival adding its own small activity to the whole. Ropes were tied to iron rings set into the stone. Planks were laid from boat to shore. Men moved back and forth across them with the ease of long familiarity, carrying and rolling and stacking with the unhurried efficiency of work that has found its own natural pace. Someone had set a small fire going a little way back from the water in a metal basin, and a few men stood near it briefly in the cold air, warming their hands before returning to the work. The cold of the river was particular. It came up from the water and from the stone simultaneously, a damp cold that settled into the hands and the feet. The fire helped, even briefly. The crates and bales and barrels accumulated on the wet stone in their slow way, each one representing a journey that had begun somewhere else, in a vineyard, in a woodland, in a grain field under the autumn sky. They had moved by boat and by cart, and by the labor of many hands to arrive here at this particular piece of stone, at this particular moment in the morning. And from here, they would disperse again into the city, into its markets and cellars and storerooms, into the kitchens and shops and ordinary lives of the people who were only now beginning to come outdoors. The river kept moving beneath the boats, under the arches of the grand pont, past the quiet islands and the stone walls of the city, on toward the west and whatever lay further along its course. It did not wait for the unloading to be finished. It simply continued as it had always continued, steady and unhurried and indifferent in the way that rivers are carrying its cold, dark water through the brightening morning of this one ordinary day in a city that was, for now, only just waking. From the river, if one were to follow the slow movement of morning away from the water, stepping off the wet stones of the quayside and moving deeper into the city, the streets would gradually fill with sound and smell long before they filled with proper light. The lanes of Paris in the 14th century were narrow, and the upper floors of the houses leaned toward one another overhead, so that the sky was only a thin gray ribbon above, and the morning came in pieces rather than all at once. Les Halles lay at the heart of the city, a little to the north and west of the river, and it had been drawing people to itself since before any living person could quite remember. Philip Augustus, the king who had surrounded Paris with its great wall, had established the market halls there in the late 12th century, raised, covered structures over the muddy ground so that merchants might have shelter and the city might have order. By the 1400s, the place had grown into something very large and very alive, a permanent gathering of the city's need for food and cloth and small necessary things. The market did not begin at any single moment. It arrived, the way morning itself arrived, incrementally, one thing and then another, until suddenly it was fully itself. The cloth merchants were among the earliest. They came with their bolts of wool wrapped in linen to protect them from the damp, and they set these heavy rolls upright in their stalls, or laid them across wooden trestles, unrolling a length here and there to let it drape and show its color. Wool from the northern towns was the great currency of medieval trade, and Paris received it from many directions. There were bolts dyed in deep madder reds and soft welled yellows, bolts of undyed gray-brown that still carried something of the animal in their texture, bolts of finer cloth from the better looms of Flanders, slightly smoother under the fingers, slightly more expensive. A merchant might run his hand along the edge of a length and say nothing at all, simply looking, while the city woke around him. The wooden poles that held the stall canopies were familiar with this hour. They had been set and struck so many thousands of times that they slotted into their worn positions without resistance, and the cloth that was stretched between them moved slowly in the small air that crept through the market at this time of morning. There was not much wind. There was only the settling of the city into its day. The fishmongers came next, or alongside. It was difficult to say. The fish that arrived in Les Halles had often spent the night traveling, carried in from the rivers and ponds around the city, or brought in by cart from further away. And the men and women who sold it worked with a deliberate quietness in these early hours, lifting each piece and placing it on the cold slate slabs that lined their stalls. Slate held the chill well, and in the morning coolness the fish lay there with a certain freshness, the eyes still clear, the scales carrying a faint iridescent color where the first thin light reached them. There were pike from the river, long and pale. There were bream and perch and tench, smaller, laid in rows. There were eels, coiled loosely in wooden buckets of water, moving sometimes with a slow patience that suggested they were not yet quite resigned to their situation. The smell of fish was present everywhere in this part of the market. A clean, cold smell in the early hour, not unpleasant, simply very much there. The way certain facts are simply present without requiring commentary. Paris ate a great deal of fish. The church calendar required abstinence from meat on Fridays and Saturdays and throughout Lent, and on the many feast days that scattered themselves across the year, and this had made the fish trade a matter of genuine importance. The fishmongers of Paris held their own guild and their own regulations and their own fierce sense of professional pride. A customer who questioned the freshness of a fish might receive a very direct response. Moving further into the market, the stalls grew closer together and the goods changed. The herbalists had their corner, and the smell of dried plants came across quite differently from the smell of raw fish, drier and more complex, something between medicine and kitchen. Bundles of lavender hung from hooks or lay in shallow baskets, their color faded from the purple of summer to a quiet gray-blue that still held something of the flower in it. Rue was there too, bitter-smelling, with its small dark bunches, used in cooking sometimes, but thought also to have protective properties. As many herbs were in this period when the boundary between the kitchen and the apothecary was not always clearly drawn. There were bundles of dried thyme and dried rosemary, their oils still present and released a little when the bundles were handled. There were small packets of cumin and pepper, the spices kept in wooden boxes to protect them from moisture, expensive and treated accordingly. An herbalist in Les Halles in the 14th century knew a great deal about plants and their properties, about what the seasons produced and what could be preserved through the winter, about what a housewife needed to stretch a stew, and what a sick person's family might ask for with a certain desperate quietness. The candles burned on the counters of some stalls, where the roof overhang kept the light from reaching properly, and their tallow smell added itself to everything else, to the fish and the wool and the herbs, and the smell of the animals that had passed through earlier in the morning, and the smell of bread drifting from the direction of the bakers, who kept their ovens working through the night and into the day. Bread was a constant presence in Paris, in the smell of it and in the thinking of it. The bakers were regulated closely by the authorities of the city, their loaves weighed and their prices watched, because bread was not simply food, but a kind of civic foundation. A shortage of bread or a dishonest wait was not merely an inconvenience, but a disruption of something that the city felt deeply. The bread stalls at Les Halles offered round loaves and long ones, white bread made from sifted flour for those who could afford it, darker bread made from less refined grain for those who could not, or who simply preferred it, which some people genuinely did. The loaves arrived still warm from the ovens of the surrounding streets and were stacked on wooden boards, and people moved toward them with the purposeful ease of those who know exactly what they want, have always known, will come back tomorrow and want the same thing again. Between the stalls, the ground was uneven, packed earth in most places and stone in others, and over the years it had taken on the contours of 1,000 footfalls, gentle depressions where people tended to step, a slight ridge where two different surfaces met. Pigeons moved across it with great confidence, as pigeons do in markets, ignoring everything that was not food, attending very carefully to everything that was. A dog moved along the edge of the fish stalls with the particular air of a dog who has learned that patience, and a certain low-profile approach occasionally yield results. The people who moved through the market at this early hour were mostly the people of the city's working life. Servants who had been sent by their households before the best goods were taken, cookwomen who knew exactly which fishmonger kept the coldest slab, and which herbalist dried their lavender well, apprentices carrying baskets that they filled with a slow thoroughness that reflected the instructions they had been given. A merchant from one of the guild halls might pass through with a purposeful step, looking at cloth, touching it, moving on. A woman from one of the parishes near the market came with a small child walking beside her, both of them quiet in the way that mourning sometimes makes people quiet. The covered halls muffled the sounds of the surrounding city a little, and within them there was a particular acoustic quality, voices and movement, and the settling of merchandise into place, all of it blending into a sound that was busy without being loud, that filled the space without pressing against it. It was the sound of a market that had been holding itself this way for a very long time, that knew its own rhythms and had no reason to hurry any of them. The morning cool held on for a while yet. The light between the stall canopies was still soft and gray and kind. Someone was arranging dried flowers at the far end of the herbalist's section, small yellow ones whose name in the old French would have been chamomile, setting them in a shallow basket with a careful hand, as though it mattered how they were arranged, which perhaps it did. And the market filled, and the morning deepened, and everything continued in the way that things continued. One small, ordinary moment setting itself gently down beside the next. Across the river, the morning moves more slowly. The Seine carries the sounds of the market away behind you now, softened by distance and by water. And the narrow bridge that leads toward the left bank is quiet at this hour, its stones still damp from the night. A thin mist sits close to the river surface, neither rising nor falling, just resting there the way mist does in autumn, as though it has no particular reason to leave. The left bank of Paris in the 14th century belongs, in a way that is difficult to describe precisely, to learning. It belongs to ink and argument and the long patience of copied text. It belongs to young men in dark gowns who have walked from distant parts of France and from England and from the German lands and from further still, drawn here by the presence of the university, which has been gathering scholars to this part of the city for well over 100 years by now. The streets here are narrower than those on the right bank. They press together, these lanes, as though the buildings on either side have leaned in slightly over the centuries, drawn toward one another by some slow gravitational habit. The upper floors of the houses extend outward on their timber frames, and this means that even on a bright morning, the street below receives only a thin stripe of sky. The light comes down in slanted pieces, falling on cobblestones that are uneven and worn smooth in the center where feet have passed for generations. There is a smell particular to these streets in the morning. It is not unpleasant, exactly, though it is dense. There is tallow smoke from the candles that burned through the night in rooms above, rooms where a student might have been reading or copying or simply lying awake, listening to the city's sounds below. There is the smell of ink, which has its own quality, dark and slightly bitter. The smell of iron gall mixed with a little gum arabic, the smell that clings to fingers and to the edges of manuscript pages. And there is the smell of damp stone, of timber, of straw that someone has laid near a doorway to soak up the mud. Along the Rue du Foire, which is named for the straw foire that students spread on the ground to sit upon during lectures, the morning is beginning to organize itself. This street is not grand. It is an ordinary lane, not wide enough for two carts to pass comfortably side by side. but it is known throughout the learned world of the 14th century. Scholars who have spent years far from Paris still remember it. It was here, or near here, that lectures were held out of doors in the earlier days of the university, masters standing and speaking, while their students settled on the straw below them, writing or listening, or both at once. By this point in the century, much of the teaching has moved indoors, into the colleges that have been founded one by one over the previous 100 years, each one a small enclosed world of its own, with a courtyard and a hall and sleeping quarters where students might share a single narrow room with 2 or 3 others. The Collège de Navarre has been here for some decades. The Collège de Harcourt. Others, smaller, less well remembered. Each college is a kind of quietness within the city, a place where the sounds of the street are muffled by thick stone walls. A scholar walking to a morning lecture moves unhurriedly. There is a quality to the pace of these men that belongs to a world in which walking is simply what one does, the primary means of moving from one place to another. And so, it has not yet acquired any particular urgency. A young man in a dark gown, his hood pulled up against the cool air, carrying under his arm a wax tablet, and perhaps a small roll of parchment. He walks with his eyes slightly downward, not from shyness, but from the habit of thought, from living a great deal of his life inside his own mind. These students come from many places, and they speak to one another in Latin, which is the shared language of the university, the language in which lectures are delivered and disputations conducted, and texts copied and annotated. To hear them speak is to hear something that belongs to no single country, but to all of them at once, Latin carrying the thoughts of scholars from Burgundy and from Aragon and from the Low Countries across the same smooth grammatical surface. Inside one of the college rooms, the morning work of copying has already begun. A student sits near the window, the only real source of light at this hour, since candles are expensive and not burned carelessly in daylight. And he is bent over a page, a quill in his right hand, the ink stone, and the small pot of ink to his left. The parchment before him is not blank. He is copying from an exemplar, a master copy that the university has authorized for reproduction, a text of Aristotle perhaps, or of one of the great theological commentators, a text that will become his own working copy once it is complete, or that he is producing for a bookseller on commission. The work is slow. Each letter requires attention. The quill must be held at the correct angle and redipped into the ink at intervals that the student has learned through long practice, often enough to keep the letters dark and consistent, not so often that the ink runs or blobs. When the ink spreads where it should not, the student pauses and reaches for a small scraper, a penknife, and lifts the unwanted ink from the parchment's surface with a careful, practiced motion. The parchment is scraped thin enough in places that light passes through it faintly, and the student knows by touch which areas can bear another pass of the scraper and which cannot. Between pages, he rests his hand, spreads his fingers flat on the edge of the desk, and looks out the window. Below, the street is quiet. A cat moves along the base of the opposite wall. A woman carries a basket of something. Two scholars pass, speaking, and their voices rise briefly before disappearing around a corner. The room itself is simple. There is the desk, which is really just a slanted board on a trestle. There is a stool. There is a pallet against the far wall, and a chest for whatever belongings the student has brought with him from home. There may be another student who sleeps in this room, though at this hour he is elsewhere. On the wall near the door, someone has scratched a name into the plaster. A previous occupant, perhaps, or a previous occupant's attempt at something permanent in a life of considerable impermanence. Being a student in 14th-century Paris is not a comfortable existence in the physical sense. The rooms are cold in winter, and fuel is a matter of careful economy. Meals are plain and not always plentiful, though the colleges provide some measure of sustenance. And yet these young men have chosen this life, or had it chosen for them by family ambition, or by some recognition that they had abilities that could be shaped and sharpened in a place like this. The life of the mind, conducted in this half-lit room, with this smell of ink and tallow, has its own satisfactions that are not easily measured in warmth or food. Outside the window, the Rue du Foire receives a little more light as the morning advances. The mist over the river is beginning to lift, slowly, without drama, and the sky above the narrow strip visible between the leaning rooftops brightens from gray to something warmer. A bell rings from a nearby church, not the great bells of Notre Dame, which are audible all across the city, but a smaller bell belonging to one of the smaller parish churches that are scattered throughout the left bank, each one serving its own small neighborhood. The student at the desk marks his place in the text with a strip of leather, sets down his quill, and reaches for a crust of bread that has been sitting on the edge of the desk since early morning. He eats it slowly, without particular attention, still looking at the page he has just completed. The letters are even and careful. The margins are straight. Hours of practice have given his hand a steadiness that was not always there. In a moment, he will take up the quill again and continue. The morning is long, and the text is long, and the work does not rush itself. This is simply what the morning holds, the slow accretion of words onto parchment, one letter following another, the way one moment follows the next, quietly, in the dim light of the left bank, while outside the narrow streets carry their ordinary sounds upward past the window and out into the brightening Paris air. The morning has been long and slow, and the city has been working steadily since the first gray light came over the water. But now the sun has climbed to the middle of the sky, or as close to the middle as a winter sun will allow in this northern city, and something in the air begins to change. The smell of it changes first, before anything else. There is smoke, of course. There has always been smoke in Paris, rising from chimneys and from the small fires that bakers keep going through every hour of the day. But this smoke is different from the morning smoke. This is the smell of fat dripping onto coals. This is the smell of onions softening slowly in an iron pot. This is the smell of bread that has been sitting near the heat just long enough to grow warm again and to release something it has been holding since it was first baked. The cookshops of Paris are open. They have been preparing since well before this hour. But it is at midday that everything becomes ready at once, and the lanes around the market halls and the river quays fill with something warm and hazy. The smoke drifts low because the air is still and cold, and it gathers in the narrow passages between buildings, between the tall timber frames that lean slightly toward one another as though sharing a secret. Walking through these passages now, a person would find themselves briefly surrounded by the smell of broth, then the smell of roasting meat, then wood smoke alone, then onion again, the smells shifting and layering as they move from one establishment to the next. The rôtisseurs are perhaps the most visible of these cooks. They keep their fires at the front of their shops, or sometimes just outside them, so that the turning spit is visible from the street. Birds turn slowly on these spits, small fowl mostly, pigeons and chickens, and the occasional duck, and the fat runs down them and falls into a pan below, and the sound of that fat sizzling is a small and ordinary sound, but it carries through the cold air with surprising clarity. A rôtisseur might have 2 or 3 spits turning at once, each one tended by a boy who keeps it moving at a slow, even pace. And the boy's face is always slightly reddened from standing so close to the fire for so long. People passing by will slow their pace near these shops. This is not something they decide to do consciously. Their feet simply slow on their own, drawn by the smell. A man carrying a bundle of cloth from one part of the city to another will pause near a rôtisseur's open front and stand there for a moment, watching the birds turn. Then he will perhaps buy a portion, a leg, or a small half-bird wrapped loosely in a piece of cloth, and he will carry it with him and eat it as he walks, tearing the meat away with his teeth and letting the warmth of it spread through his chest. This is how many Parisians eat their midday meal. Not everyone in this city has a hearth of their own. The tall, crowded tenements along the busiest streets often have no kitchen at all, or only a small shared fire that belongs to the ground floor and is not meant for every resident. And so the city has, over a very long time, developed an entire economy of cooked food sold in the streets and from small shops, and it is an economy that works very well. The guilds regulate it, as they regulate most things. There are rules about what a cookshop may sell and how it must be prepared. There are inspectors who walk through the market halls and taste what is being offered to ensure it is not spoiled, not deceptive, not short in measure. The city takes the selling of cooked food seriously because food is the ordinary business of ordinary life, and ordinary life must be kept in order. Beyond the rôtisseurs, there are the sellers of pottage. Pottage is perhaps the most common food in all of medieval Europe, and Paris is no exception. It is a thick soup, or sometimes something thicker than soup, closer to a porridge, made from whatever vegetables are available and whatever grain the cook is working with today. In winter, pottage might be made from dried peas, or lentils, or turnips, cooked down slowly in a large iron pot with a little fat and a little salt, and perhaps some herbs that have been dried and kept from the summer. It is not an exciting food. It is a warm and filling food, and warmth and filling are what the body asks for on a cold January day in a city where most people have been on their feet since before the sun rose. A woman selling pottage from a large pot near one of the bridges has been standing in the same spot since mid-morning. She keeps a small fire burning underneath the pot to keep it from cooling. She has a ladle, and she has pottery bowls, and when someone stops at her cart, she ladles out a portion and passes them the bowl, and they stand nearby and eat it, and they hand the bowl back when they are finished. The bowls are not washed between customers, not in any thorough way, a quick wipe with a cloth, perhaps. But no one thinks much about this. The pottage is hot enough that it seems to clean itself. The students from the left bank sometimes wander this far in the midday hour, crossing one of the bridges on foot and finding their way to where the food sellers are densest. A student who has a few small coins might buy a bowl of pottage and a piece of coarse bread and stand eating it in the cold. And this is his midday, and it is enough. There is something in his posture as he stands there, slightly hunched against the cold, holding the warm bowl with both hands, that speaks of a certain quiet contentment, the particular satisfaction of being hungry, and then being less hungry, which is one of the simplest pleasures available to anyone. The taverns, too, are full. Not full in a rowdy way, not at this hour, not on an ordinary day, but full in the way that warm places become full in winter, with people who have found a reason to sit down for a while and linger over a cup of wine. The wine served in ordinary Parisian taverns is local wine, thin and slightly sour, served in clay cups or in small wooden mugs. It is not good wine, not the wine that wealthy merchants or cathedral canons would drink with their meals, but it is wine, and it warms the throat, and sitting down feels good after a morning of walking. The smell inside a tavern at midday is its own particular combination: wine and smoke, and the wet wool of damp cloaks hung near the fire to dry, and underneath all of that, the persistent smell of old wood, of a building that has absorbed years of the same smells and holds them in its timbers. The fire in the center, or along one wall, puts out a good heat, and the light inside is dim, coming mostly from the fire itself, and from a small window or two that lets in the pale winter daylight. People sit at rough wooden benches and talk in low voices, or sometimes do not talk at all, but simply sit and look at the fire. Outside, the bells of Notre Dame carry across the rooftops. The cathedral is not far from much of this commerce. Paris is not a large city by later standards, and its sounds travel through it easily. The bells do not announce anything dramatic at this hour. They simply mark the time as they have marked it all morning and will mark it all afternoon. Each ring of the bell, a slow step through the day, each one sounding very much like the last. The smell of cooking will not last forever. It is already beginning to thin slightly as the midday hour stretches on and the morning's preparations are eaten through. A rôtisseur's spit that held 4 birds at the start of the hour may hold only 1 or 2 now. The pottage woman's pot is lower than it was. The city has eaten what it needed, or most of it has, and the urgency of hunger has passed for now, replaced by the heavier, slower feeling of the afternoon that is about to begin. For a little while, though, it hangs in the air, that warm, greasy, comfortable smell of a city feeding itself in the cold. It settles into clothing and into hair. It drifts up the narrow stairs of the tenements and slips under the doors of rooms where people are resting for a brief moment before the afternoon begins. It is not a refined smell, not a beautiful smell in any formal sense, but it is a deeply human one, the smell of fire and food and winter, and ordinary life going on as it always has. The afternoon is just beginning to open in front of the city, quiet and gray and full of small tasks. But for this one moment, the midday smoke is still rising, and the city is still warm from its meal. There is a house near the place to grieve, not far from the river, where a cloth merchant has lived and worked for many years. It is an ordinary house by the standards of a prosperous Parisian tradesman, neither grand nor poor, but solid and purposeful, built to last across generations. The timber frame is dark with age, the plaster between the beams a pale grayish white, and the whole structure rises 3 full floors above the street, with a small storage loft above that, tucked beneath the steep pitched roof. The ground floor belongs to trade. This is where the day's work is done, where the bolts of cloth are stored and unrolled and examined and sold. The room is dim even in the afternoon, because the shutters are kept mostly closed to protect the fabric from too much light. Only a narrow wedge of the outside world comes in, the distant sound of the street, the occasional shadow of someone passing close by the door. The floor here is hard-packed earth, covered with a thin layer of rushes that have been there long enough to feel almost like part of the floor itself. The smell in the room is dry and faintly dusty, the smell of wool and linen, and the cedar wood of the large storage chest in the corner. The merchant's counter is a heavy board laid across 2 trestles, worn smooth along the front edge from years of hands resting there, customers leaning in to look, to feel the nap of a cloth, to consider the weight and color of a length of good Flemish wool. Behind the counter, rolls of fabric stand upright in a rack, some wrapped in linen to keep the dust away. There is dark blue cloth from Bruges, a warm russet brown from further south, and a length of undyed gray wool that is the cheapest of all, the kind a working family might save for over several months. Against the far wall, There is a single stool and a small table where the merchant's apprentice sits on quiet afternoons, copying numbers into a narrow ledger by the light of a tallow candle. The candle sits in an iron holder fixed to the wall, and it burns slowly, sending up a thin thread of smoke toward the ceiling beams. The ceiling beams are dark and low, hung with a few bundles of dried herbs, and a small woven basket that seems to have been there long enough that no one remembers exactly what was put inside it. The stairs are steep and very narrow, built into one corner of the ground floor behind a heavy wooden door. They creak quietly under any weight, each step slightly different from the last, some higher, some shallower, as if the carpenter who built them was working from feel rather than measurement. Climbing them slowly, one step at a time, the noise of the street below gradually fades. The second floor is where the household does much of its living. There's a main room here that serves as both a hall for eating and a sitting room in the quieter hours of the afternoon. The floor is laid with broad wooden planks, and those planks are also scattered with rushes, fresh ones, changed more often than those downstairs, mixed with a little dried lavender and sweet flag, so that the room carries a faint green, herbal smell. It is the kind of smell that one notices first upon entering, and then gradually stops noticing at all. The way the smell of a home always fades into the background once one has been inside long enough. The furniture in this room is heavy and dark and very solid. There is a long table of oak, flanked by two benches, and at its head a single chair with arms, the merchant's chair, which no one else uses when he is present. There is a large dresser against one wall, a piece of furniture that functions partly as storage and partly as a kind of display. Its shelves holding several pewter plates and two shallow pewter bowls, and a small brass cup that came originally from somewhere further east and is kept as much for its appearance as for any practical purpose. The pewter plates catch what little afternoon light comes into the room and hold it for a moment, a dull pewter gleam. The window in this room is the finest thing in the house. It has small panes of thick greenish glass set into a leaded frame, and in the middle of the afternoon, it lets in a rectangle of pale, slightly distorted light that falls across the corner of the table and onto the floor planks in a wavering, gentle shape. The glass is not perfectly clear. It has bubbles and ripples in it that bend the light in small, interesting ways, so that the rectangle on the floor is not a clean square, but something softer and more irregular, shifting very slightly as the clouds outside move across the sky. Most houses in the city do not have glass in their windows at all. Oiled cloth or wooden shutters serve well enough for most people. The glass is a point of quiet pride, though no one in the house would think to say so directly. Near the window there is a low wooden bench with a folded blanket on it, an old blanket of dark wool, worn soft and thin at the edges. On top of the blanket, arranged in a comfortable curve, the household cat is sleeping. It is a gray and white cat of indeterminate age, broad across the middle, with its front paws tucked neatly beneath its chest and its eyes closed completely. It breathes slowly, its sides rising and falling with great deliberate calm. It has been in this position for most of the afternoon and shows no sign of intending to leave it. A small stripe of light from the window falls just short of the cat, close enough that by late afternoon it will reach the edge of the blanket. And perhaps the cat knows this and is waiting. On a hook beside the door, there hangs a woman's cloak, a good woolen cloak with a hood in a deep reddish-brown color. The merchant's wife has gone out, to the market, perhaps, or to visit a neighbor, and the cloak remaining on its hook gives the room a sense of recent occupation, as if she has only just left and might return at any moment. There's a small basket near the foot of the wall, half filled with raw wool waiting to be carded, and beside it, 2 wooden spindles, one with a little gray thread already wound around it. These are the ordinary tools of a household, used in the spare moments of the day, the work that moves forward slowly and steadily, a little at a time. In a smaller room off the main hall, there is a hearth, the only hearth in the house, built into the outside wall with a hood of plaster and stone to carry the smoke upward. The fire here has been built up in the last hour or so in preparation for the evening meal, and it is burning steadily now, its warmth spreading into the main hall through the open doorway. A pot hangs on an iron chain above the fire, a heavy iron pot in which something is simmering, probably a pottage of some kind, vegetables and grain, and a little salted pork, the kind of dish that can be started in the late morning and left to its own work through the afternoon, needing only an occasional stir. The smell of it drifts through the whole upper floor, warm and faintly savory, blending with the lavender in the rushes and the wool smell from the basket by the wall. Above this floor, there are sleeping rooms, smaller and plainer than the hall below. The merchant and his wife sleep in one room, the apprentice in another, the children, if there are children, in a third, 3 of them perhaps sharing a single straw-stuffed mattress and a heap of woolen blankets. These rooms have no glass in the windows, only wooden shutters now pulled partway, closed against the afternoon. Beds are simple wooden frames with ropes strung across them in a lattice to support the mattress, and the mattresses are covered with rough linen ticking. In the corner of one room, there is a small wooden chest for storing clothes, and on top of the chest, there is a single candle stub in a clay holder, not yet lit. The rooms are quiet and slightly dim at this hour, the way a house feels in the middle of the afternoon when the people who live in it are elsewhere, occupied with the small, busy business of daily life. Back in the main hall, the light from the glazed window has moved a little as the afternoon continues its slow passage. The rectangle of distorted pale light has shifted a few inches further across the floorboards, and now its edge just touches the corner of the folded blanket. The cat on the bench has not moved, or has moved only to adjust itself very slightly, settling deeper into its comfortable position. The fire in the side room continues its quiet work. The pot simmers. The shadows between the beams are a little deeper than they were an hour ago, and the afternoon folds slowly and gently into itself, the house around it calm and ordinary and warm. Notre Dame de Paris stood at the eastern end of the Isle de la Cité, as it had stood for more than a century already by the 1300s. Its great towers rose into the afternoon sky above the river, above the rooftops, above the slow turning of the city below. The stone of its facade was old enough by then to have darkened in places, to have softened at its edges, to carry within its grain the memory of rain and frost and long summers of pale northern light. The building had been begun around 1163, and its main structure had been more or less complete for several decades by the time our 14th-century afternoon arrives. 100 years of footsteps had worn the threshold smooth. 100 years of hands had touched the same door jambs, the same curved stone of the archways, leaving behind them the faintest traces of wear, the gentlest rounding of what had once been sharp. To walk toward the cathedral from the streets of the island was to feel the city change its character gradually. The lanes near the cathedral were quieter than those along the river. There were canons and clerks moving between the church and the episcopal buildings nearby, their robes dark against the pale stone. There were ordinary people crossing the Parvis, the wide open space before the great west facade, not always with any particular purpose, sometimes simply pausing for a moment before passing on. The west facade itself rose in 3 great horizontal registers, each one distinct. The lower register held the 3 portals, their doorways deep and shadowed, their tympana carved with figures that had stood in those positions for generations. Christ in judgment, the Virgin and the gathered saints, the last things death, and what was thought to come after. These images were not meant to frighten in any sharp or sudden way. They were simply present, as the stone was present, as the river was present. They were the backdrop against which daily life moved without particularly pausing to look. To step through one of those doorways was to move from afternoon into something else entirely. The interior of Notre Dame on an ordinary weekday afternoon in the 14th century would have been cool. Not cold in the sharp way of winter, but cool in the way that large stone buildings hold onto the memory of cooler hours, releasing warmth slowly and reluctantly. The walls were thick. The floor was stone. The air moved very little once inside, settling into a kind of stillness that felt different from the stillness of an empty room. It was not entirely dark. The cathedral had its windows, great rose windows in the west and the 2 transepts, and along the nave, the high clear-story windows that had been the technical achievement of the builders a century before. Flying buttresses on the outside made it possible to open those upper walls, to let in light that would otherwise have been impossible in a building of such height and mass. The light that came through those windows in the afternoon was not bright. It was filtered, colored, broken into the irregular geometries of the glass itself. Much of the original 13th century glass would still have been in place in the 1400s, though some had been replaced or repaired over the decades, as glass inevitably requires. The Great West Rose, rebuilt around 1225, sent down into the nave a diffuse reddish and golden color on afternoons when the sun was in the west. It did not illuminate so much as it tinted. The nave below was not a place of sharp visibility. Faces across the space were soft-edged. The far end of the choir was dim, distinguishable by the glow of candles rather than by any particular clarity. Those candles burned at the side altars, and there were many side altars in a medieval cathedral of this size and age. Notre Dame had accumulated chapels along its nave aisles and around its choir over the decades, added by donors and guilds and wealthy individuals who wished to endow a perpetual light, a regular mass, a specific prayer. Each of these chapels had its candles. The cumulative effect along the nave was a series of small, warm glows, unevenly spaced, some brighter than others, some guttering slightly in the faint movement of air that passed when a door opened at the west end. A few people were seated in the nave on an ordinary afternoon like this one. Medieval churches did not have permanent pews as later churches would. The floor of the nave was open, and people who wished to sit might bring a small stool or simply kneel on the stone. But there were usually some people present, not for any scheduled service, simply in the way that people in a city sometimes step into a large, quiet building for a few minutes of private quiet. A woman near one of the side chapels knelt with her hands folded, her lips moving slightly, looking toward the small painted figure on the altar before her. She was not obviously wealthy, not obviously poor. She was simply there, in the way that people were simply there throughout the day. The cathedral serving as a kind of constant background to the life of the city around it. The smell of the place was its own kind of presence. Incense had been burned at the morning offices and would be burned again at vespers. But even between those hours, the scent of it clung to the stone, to the fabric hangings, to the air itself. Beneath the incense, there was the smell of old stone, which is not quite any other smell. It is cool and faintly mineral, suggesting depth and age, without particularly suggesting any specific thing. There was also, faintly, the smell of wax from the candles, and something harder to name, the accumulated scent of a place where many people have been for a very long time. The floor of the cathedral was not entirely plain. Some portions had tomb slabs set into them, commemorating bishops and canons and benefactors, whose names and dates were carved into the stone underfoot. To walk across the nave was to walk across a kind of layered record, though on an ordinary afternoon there was no particular reason to think about this. The slabs were simply part of the floor. People walked over them without much thought, as they walked over everything that had become ordinary through long familiarity. The choir screen, which separated the choir from the nave, was an elaborate piece of carved stone and wood. It would be partially dismantled in later centuries, but in the 1400s it still stood as a kind of interior wall, pierced with openings, decorated with painted and gilded figures, marking the boundary between the part of the cathedral where the canons sang their offices and the part where the general population moved. Beyond the screen, on an ordinary afternoon, the choir was quieter still. A single canon or a clerk might be there, reading or preparing for the coming evening hours. The light in the apse, at the far eastern end of the cathedral, came from the windows above the high altar and from the chapels that radiated outward around the ambulatory. These windows were smaller than the great rose windows, but numerous, and their light in the afternoon came from directions that shifted as the sun moved. At some hours, the apse glowed warmly. At others, it was dim and peaceful, the gold of altar furnishings catching the candlelight in small, bright points. A cathedral like Notre Dame in this period was not a museum or a monument in the modern sense. It was a working building, used daily and throughout the day, with offices sung at fixed hours from matins before dawn to Compline in the evening. The canons who served the cathedral had their routines, their obligations, their ordinary professional lives within these walls. The building was their place of work as much as it was anyone's place of prayer. But on an ordinary afternoon, between the midday office and the next hour of singing, the cathedral simply rested in its own quiet. The afternoon light was moving. It always moved, the particular quality of it shifting as the sun declined toward the west, the colors in the high windows changing slightly, the shadows in the nave growing longer and cooler. By mid-afternoon, the building was at its most peaceful. The morning's business was finished. The evening was not yet arrived. The candles burned in their small chapels. The stone held its coolness. The woman by the side altar had finished her prayer and moved quietly toward the west door, her footsteps soft on the old floor. Outside, the city continued. The river continued. The sounds of the streets, voices, animals, the movement of goods from one place to another, all of it continued at its steady, ordinary pace. But inside the cathedral, on this particular afternoon, there was only the light coming down through the high windows, and the candles burning, and the smell of old stone and old incense settling into the cool air, and the building itself resting as it had rested for over a century, holding the afternoon in its wide and patient interior. The afternoon was getting on now. The light over the city had lost its sharpness, and the shadows between the buildings had grown a little longer, a little softer, the way they do in the hours before evening properly begins. Paris in the 14th century was a city of particular smells, and as the day moved toward its close, those smells settled and deepened, as if the city itself were breathing out after the long exertion of the morning. The craftsmen had been at their work since early light, and they would continue for a while yet. The guilds of Paris were very old organizations, some of them stretching back 2 centuries or more, and they governed the working day with considerable care. A goldsmith was not simply a goldsmith. He was a member of a brotherhood with its own regulations, its own feast days, its own responsibilities to the city and to the church. The goldsmiths had their workshops along certain streets near the Grand Pont, the great bridge that crossed the Seine to the right bank, and they worked with fire and very small tools in rooms that smelled of metal and charcoal. A goldsmith's workshop in this period would have been a small place, not much larger than an ordinary room. The hearth was central to everything, used for heating the small crucibles in which metal was melted and worked. The craftsman sat close to the light, bending over pieces of silver or gold with instruments no larger than a finger. There was a great deal of patience required in this work, and a certain kind of particular silence, the kind that comes from deep concentration rather than from emptiness. Apprentices moved carefully in the background, maintaining the fire, cleaning tools, watching and learning the gestures that would eventually become their own. Not far away, in other parts of the city, the coopers were finishing their day. Coopers made barrels and casks, and there was an enormous need for their work in a city that ran on wine and salted fish and stored grain. The coopering districts had a particular sound to them, a steady rhythmic knock of mallets driving iron hoops down over curved wooden staves, a sound that had been part of the city's daily texture for as long as anyone could remember. The barrels took shape slowly, each one requiring many careful steps. The wood had to be bent and fitted and sealed with practiced hands. It was hard physical work, and the coopers tended to be strong, steady men who moved with the economy of motion that comes from doing the same task many thousands of times. And then there were the tanneries. The tanneries occupied a stretch near the river on the left bank, placed there deliberately so that the water could be drawn and the waste could be released downstream. Tanning leather was one of the oldest and most necessary trades in any medieval city, and it was also one of the most powerfully scented. The smell of a tannery district carried a considerable distance, a complex mixture of oak bark and animal hides and lime and water that had been sitting in deep stone pits for a long time. It was not a gentle smell. It was heavy and organic, the kind of smell that settled into clothing and hair and stayed there through the evening meal and beyond. The process of tanning involved soaking hides in a sequence of solutions over many weeks. First, the hides arrived raw from the butchers, still carrying the smell of recent slaughter. They were soaked in lime to remove the hair, then washed and scraped, then moved through a series of pits filled with tannin solution made from crushed oak bark. The tannin slowly bound to the proteins in the hide, transforming something that would otherwise rot into something durable and supple. It was a patient process. A good piece of leather might take months to produce, and the tanner needed to know by sight and touch when each hide was ready to move to the next stage. The workers in the tanneries stood at the edges of these pits, moving the hides with long wooden poles, turning them and repositioning them with a careful slowness. Their hands and arms were stained dark from the tannin, a stain that never fully washed away. They worked in a kind of fog of steam and bark smell, and they had long since stopped noticing it, the way people stop noticing the particular smell of their own homes. The river moved past nearby, gray-green and quiet in the late afternoon, carrying everything away. Further from the river, the smell changed, and the trades changed with it. The wax chandlers worked in cooler, dimmer rooms, and their trade was quieter by nature. Candles were essential in a city where the working day extended beyond the last of the natural light, where churches burned them continuously at every altar, where households of even modest means kept a supply of tallow lights for the long winter evenings. The wax chandlers who made candles from pure beeswax worked on the finer end of this trade, producing candles for churches and wealthy households. Beeswax burned more cleanly than tallow, with a gentler, slightly sweet smell, and it was considerably more expensive. The pressing of candles was slow, meditative work. The wax was melted in a deep pot and then carefully poured around a linen wick, or the wick was dipped repeatedly into the wax, building up each candle layer by thin layer over many repetitions. The chandler worked steadily and without hurry, hanging the finished candles on frames to cool and harden, their surfaces smooth and pale as old ivory. There was a faint warmth in the room from the heated wax, and a soft, clean smell, a pleasant contrast to the harder smells of the streets outside. A little distance away, in one of the narrow lanes off a main thoroughfare, a cobbler was finishing up for the day. The cobbler's trade was one of the most common in any medieval city, for leather shoes wore out with the regular brutality of cobblestone streets, and the city's population generated a continuous demand for repair and replacement. The cobbler sat close to his window for the light, working a piece of leather sole back onto a worn boot with a small hammer, each tap precise and unhurried. The hammer sound was a quiet thing, different from the cooper's mallet, more considered, more personal in scale. A shoe held in the hands is a small object. It requires small gestures. The leather on the cobbler's workbench was a different quality from the tannery's raw hides, already finished, already softened, already dyed in deep browns and blacks, and the occasional dark red. He worked with an awl and a curved needle and thread made from linen or hemp, stitching with the particular grip and tension that comes from years of practice. His fingers were calloused in the specific places that this work made calluses. He did not need to think about the gestures. They had become part of the way his body moved through the world. Working day in Paris did not end all at once. Different trades kept different rhythms, and the guild regulations specified when work ought to cease, though the ending crept up gradually rather than arriving in a sudden moment. As the light outside the windows deepened from bright gold to something softer and more amber, the craftsmen began the small ceremonies of closing. Tools were set down carefully, cleaned, and put away in their places. Fires in the hearths were banked or allowed to die back to coals. Apprentices swept the floors of their workshops with slow brooms, the dust rising briefly and settling again. The goldsmith covered his work with a cloth and moved away from his bench, stretching slightly, a gesture so ordinary and human that it could have belonged to any century. The coopers set down their mallets and rolled the finished barrels to their storage places with soft, rumbling sounds across the wooden floors. The chandlers' candles hung cooling on their frames, row after row of pale shapes in the dimming room. The cobbler made a final stitch, bit the thread, and set the repaired boot with its mate on the shelf near the door, ready for whoever would come to collect it in the morning. Outside, the city's afternoon noise was settling. The market cries had mostly stopped. The traffic on the streets was thinning, the loaded carts fewer now, the pace of walking slower and less purposeful. A dog moved through a lane with unhurried certainty, its nose close to the ground. Somewhere nearby, a bell was ringing in a small church, not the great bells of Notre Dame, but something smaller, a neighborhood bell, marking the hour with a sound that was familiar and domestic and entirely unremarkable. The tanneries were quiet now, the workers gone, the pits left to their slow chemical work through the night. The river moved past in the deepening light, carrying its gray-green water steadily toward the west, the way it always had, the way it would continue long after every cobbler and chandler and tanner had finished their last day's work and gone home to whatever waited for them there. And now the bells begin, not all at once. They never rang all at once in Paris. They arrived in overlapping waves, one tower finding its voice, and then another answering from across the water, and then another further still, until the whole city was trembling gently with the sound of vespers ringing out above the rooftops. It was the hour of early evening. The sky had been turning for some time already, moving from the clear pale blue of late afternoon into something warmer, something amber at the edges where the sun had gone low behind the western rooftops. The color deepening to gray and violet higher up where the sky was still open and wide. The Seine caught the light in the way it always did at this hour. The surface of the river turned a dull, soft gold, and then, as the minutes passed and the light continued to fade, that gold grew more muted, more gray, until the water looked dark and still and patient, as it had looked at the end of every day for as long as anyone in the city could remember. The bells of Notre Dame rang longest and deepest. They were the largest bells in Paris, and their sound carried far, moving outward across the Isle de la Cité and over both banks of the river, into the tanners' quarter and the students' quarter and the merchants' streets beyond. People who had lived in the city their whole lives no longer fully heard the bells as distinct sounds. They felt them, perhaps, in the pauses between thoughts. They felt them in the way the body knows it is time to stop one thing and begin another. In the markets, the feeling had already begun some time before the bells confirmed it. The vegetable sellers had been packing their baskets since the afternoon shadows stretched long across the ground. The fish sellers had wrapped their remaining stock or sold it at a late discount, and the smell of the fish market was beginning to clear on the evening air, which was cooler now, carrying just a little of the river's dampness and the faint sourness of old stone. The carts were moving. That was one of the reliable sounds of this hour, the low creak and rumble of wooden cartwheels on the uneven streets, the slow clop of hooves on cobblestone, as the market carts made their way back toward the city gates or down to the river bank, or through the narrow lanes toward the stables behind the great houses. They moved without hurry. The horses knew the way. The drivers sat with their shoulders settled and their eyes half open, letting the animals follow the familiar route while the evening air moved around them. Doors were closing. That was another sound of this hour. The heavy wooden doors of the workshops and the guild halls, the smaller doors of the cookshops and the bread cellars, closing with the solid thud of wood on stone, the turn of a latch, the scrape of a bolt being drawn. Not all at once, not in any organized sequence, but one by one, as each householder or shopkeeper finished the particular small task that had kept them a few minutes longer than the rest. The custom of the lamps was already beginning. In Paris, by long tradition, and by the ordinances that had been issued and reissued over the years by the city's authorities, householders were expected to hang a lamp outside their door in the evening hours. The lamps were small things, often just a simple iron bracket or a loop of metal fixed beside the doorframe, from which a small vessel of oil could be suspended. The wick would be lit as the daylight failed, and the lamp would burn through the early part of the night, casting a small pool of warm amber light onto the street just outside the door. They were not bright. No single lamp could do very much against the darkness that settled into the narrow streets of medieval Paris. But the lamps were many. Walking through the city at this hour meant moving through a long succession of small lights, each one warm and low, each one casting its brief circle of illumination onto the stones and the timber and the passing faces of people making their way home. Between one lamp and the next, there would be a stretch of deeper shadow, and then another pool of warmth, and then shadow again. The streets were never truly dark while the lamps burned. They were something gentler than dark. They were dim and softened and full of the kind of half shadow that makes everything feel a little further away, a little quieter, a little more at rest. In the side streets and alleys where fewer lamps burned, cats moved silently along the bases of walls. Paris had always had a great many cats, living in the spaces between the human city and its stores of grain and its winter provisions. At this hour, they came out more freely, picking their way along the gutters and the ledges and the narrow gaps between the close-packed houses, their eyes very well suited to the half-light. The river traffic had slowed to almost nothing. The last of the day's cargo boats had tied up at the quays, their hulls sitting low and still in the dark water. The boatmen had gone to their supper, or to the taverns near the water, where the light inside was warm and the sounds were muffled by thick walls and the noise of people settling into the end of the day. On the water itself, there was very little movement now, just the gentle rocking of the moored boats, the soft lap of the Seine against the stone of the quay, the occasional sound of water moving around a bridge pier somewhere upstream. The bridges of Paris were still busy for a little while after Vespers. They were the main crossings between the island and both banks, and people still moved across them in the early evening, workers heading home, students walking back to their rooms on the left bank, servants carrying messages or provisions from one part of the city to another. But the pace on the bridges had slowed from the bustle of the afternoon. People walked with less urgency. The conversations, if there were any, were quieter. The great church of Notre Dame stood at the eastern end of the island, its towers now rising into a sky that had turned almost entirely gray above the amber glow along the western horizon. Inside the cathedral, the canons were singing the Vespers office, their voices moving through the long nave and up into the vaulted stone above them. The sound did not carry far outside the thick walls. Inside, it was a complete world of its own, candlelight and incense, and the slow, unhurried rhythm of the chanted psalms, the same psalms that had been sung at this hour in this place for generations, and would be sung again tomorrow and the day after, and through every season of every year that followed. In the streets nearby, the sound that carried was simpler. A woman calling out from an upper window, the sound of a shutter being closed, the brief clatter of something dropped in a kitchen somewhere behind a closed door, and then silence again. Smoke rose from the chimneys of the houses, visible against the last pale light in the west. In the 14th century, most cooking was done over open hearths, and the smell of wood smoke was a constant presence in the city, but most noticeable at the end of the day when the evening meal was being prepared in kitchen after kitchen, in great houses and small ones alike. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was the smell of warmth, of bread being kept near the fire, of broth sitting in its pot over coals that would hold their heat for hours. The city was drawing inward. That is perhaps the simplest way to describe what happened in Paris as Vespers faded and the lamps took over from the failing daylight. Everything that had spread outward through the day, the commerce, the movement, the long reach of trade and noise and human activity, began very gently, very gradually, to gather itself back in. The streets grew quieter. The spaces between people grew larger. The voices that had filled the markets and the workshops and the crowded lanes softened and separated and eventually fell still, replaced by the small domestic sounds of houses settling into their evenings. The lamp outside a door on a quiet street near the river burned with a small, steady flame. The oil was good, and the wick was trimmed properly, and the flame did not gutter or smoke. It simply burned, casting its circle of warm light onto the wet stones below it, where earlier in the day there had been the noise and press and busy movement of a city fully alive to itself. Now the stones were quiet. The light lay on them softly, and the city breathed, and the river moved in its slow and ancient way toward the sea. The supper hour has come to Paris. Across the city, in rooms low-ceilinged and warm with the last of the day's fire, families are settling themselves around their tables. The tables are simple things, planks resting on trestles in many homes, pulled close to the hearth where the embers still hold their heat. A bench on one side, perhaps a stool or two. A single candle set near the center of the table, its flame very still in the quiet air. The meal being placed on these tables is much the same in household after household through the city's older and poorer quarters. A loaf of bread, dense and dark, made from a mixture of rye and wheat. A pot of pottage that has been simmering since late afternoon, thick with onions, leeks, dried peas, perhaps a small quantity of turnip softened almost to nothing by the long heat. In households that have done a little better this week, there is a piece of salted fish, herring most likely, rinsed and set on a board to share among the family. And there is a cup of thin wine, pale and faintly sour, mixed with water so that it stretches further, so that it sits lighter in the stomach before sleep. This is the ordinary supper of ordinary Paris. A husband and wife, a grandmother perhaps seated closest to the warmth, 2 or 3 children arranged along the bench. The youngest child is already leaning against her mother's arm, her eyes half closed before the bread has even been passed. The older children eat more deliberately, pulling small pieces from the loaf, dipping them into the pottage without much speaking. The day has been long. There is a particular quality to the tiredness in the room, not unpleasant, not anxious. Just the deep, honest tiredness of hours spent at work. In a slightly larger house not far from one of the city's covered markets, a cloth merchant has come home later than the others, having stayed to settle an account with a supplier from the south. His wife has held supper for him. She has kept the pottage warm by pushing the pot to the side of the fire. And now she sets it before him without ceremony or comment. The way that 2 people do things for each other when they have lived together long enough that gestures speak clearly on their own. He tears his bread and does not speak much at first. He drinks his wine slowly. The candle on their table is a slightly better one than in the houses nearby, tallow still, but made with a little more care, burning with a steadier, less smoky flame. The sounds of the meal are small and particular. The soft knock of a wooden bowl against the table, the quiet scrape of a spoon along the bottom of the pot, someone setting down a cup, the snap of the fire settling in the hearth. In the street outside, there is almost nothing, a step passing now and then, the distant closing of a door somewhere further along the lane. Paris has drawn itself very far inward now, and the sounds of it have become intimate, close, domestic. The great noise of the daytime city, the criers and the carts, and the crowding of the markets, all of that is very far away from this table and this candle. Children in Paris went to sleep early. There was no particular reason to keep them awake once the meal was finished, and the warmth and the food and the shortening of the autumn light made sleep come easily. The youngest children were put to bed on straw pallets, tucked against the wall where the house was most sheltered, covered with rough wool. An older child might stay up a little longer, sitting near the fire while the adults finished their wine and spoke in low voices about small things, about what needed doing tomorrow, about the state of the neighbor's cow, about the price of candles, about nothing much at all. These conversations have a particular texture. They are not the conversations of people who are debating ideas or settling great questions. They are the conversations of people who are simply being present together at the end of a day, making the small sounds of companionship before the silence of sleep takes over. A sentence here, a pause, a few words in return. The grandmother nods at something said and then says nothing further, her eyes resting somewhere toward the middle distance of the fire. In the monasteries and convents of Paris, the religious houses that stand within and at the edges of the city, the evening meal has already been taken in the refectory, plainer still than anything on the secular tables, eaten in silence, while one of the monks read aloud from a devotional text. After supper, the community has gathered for Compline, the last of the canonical hours, the office that closes the day. The chanting of Compline is quiet, slower than the other offices, set in lower registers. It is designed to settle the mind, to ease the community toward the night. After Compline comes the great silence, and no voice is raised until morning. The candles in the refectory are snuffed one by one. Back in the city's lanes and courtyards, the evening meal is winding down. The pottage pot has been scraped and set aside. What remains of the bread is wrapped in cloth against the morning. The cups are rinsed with a little water from the pail by the door. These small acts of tidying are done quietly, almost automatically. The same acts performed every evening, in the same order, the body knowing the sequence without needing to be told. There is something very peaceful in the repetition of small domestic tasks at the end of a day. The fire in the hearth is allowed to burn lower. In many households, it will not be entirely extinguished. Keeping a live coal overnight is easier than striking a new fire in the morning. But it is no longer fed, and it settles into itself, glowing red and orange, giving off a dry, pleasant warmth that fills the lower part of the room. The children on the pallets are entirely asleep now. One of them has turned onto his side, his knees drawn up, his breathing slow and even. The youngest is still against the wall, her face slack and open with the complete unconsciousness of childhood sleep. The adults move quietly around them, careful of the boards that creak. The candle on the table has been burning since before supper, and it is noticeably shorter now. The wax around its base has pooled and hardened into small pale ripples. The flame itself has diminished slightly, grown a little quieter as the wick has burned deeper into the candle. It casts its circle of light across the table, across the edge of the bread cloth, across the hands of the couple sitting in the last of the evening's conversation. There's not much more to say tonight. There rarely is at this hour. The day has been what it has been. Tomorrow will come in its own time. Outside, Paris is as quiet as Paris ever becomes, which is to say, not entirely quiet, because cities are never entirely quiet, but quiet enough. A dog somewhere across the lane. The faint, distant sound of the river, which is always there, even when it cannot be quite identified as itself, only felt as a kind of presence beneath the other sounds. One of the oil lamps hung outside a door along the street has already guttered out, its small fuel exhausted. The street in that stretch is darker now, the shadows having closed over the spot where the lamp's circle of light had been. It does not particularly matter. The night has fully arrived. There is no more need for the lamp. The grandmother has made her way to her corner of the room and is already lying down, her breathing slow, her hands folded. The children do not stir. The merchant's wife has set the cloth firmly around what remains of the loaf and has straightened the bench against the table. The candle on the table is very low now. Its flame bends slightly in some current of air that moves through the room, the house breathing, in a way, the timbers and thatch settling into the cooler air of the night. The flame recovers. It burns on for a little while longer, steady and small and warm, illuminating nothing in particular, just the grain of the wood, just the settled darkness of the room, just the sleeping shapes of the household arranged around the diminishing fire. And then the last light on the table is covered with a careful hand, and the darkness closes gently over the room, and the house becomes one more dark shape among all the dark shapes of Paris, lying quietly along its river, under its autumn sky, breathing in and breathing out through the long and dreamless hours of the night. And now the last bell begins. It comes first from somewhere to the east, a single deep stroke rolling out over the rooftops, and then another tower answers it, a little to the south, and then another, further away, closer to the river. Compline, the last of the 8 canonical hours, the prayer that closes the day and hands the city over to darkness and to sleep. The word compline comes from the Latin completorium, the hour of completion. And that is what this is. The day is complete. Whatever was unfinished must remain unfinished until morning. The bells say so, one after another, their voices overlapping in long, slow waves across the tile and thatch of 14th-century Paris. Each one fading before the next has quite finished, so that the whole sound becomes something soft and layered, like cloth folded over cloth. In the churches themselves, the monks and canons stand or kneel in their choir stalls, their breath visible in the cold air, their voices low and even. The Compline liturgy is brief and gentle, a hymn, a short reading, the psalms that belong to this hour, psalms of nighttime, of trust, of lying down in safety. And then the Nunc Dimittis, the canticle of Simeon, very old words, spoken quietly into the dark. Lord, now let your servant depart in peace. There is something in those words that belongs to every ending, to every night, to every small surrender into sleep. The candles on the altar burn steadily. Outside, The city is already very still. The streets that ran with noise and motion only a few hours ago are now nearly empty. A pair of feet might pass along the Rue Saint-Denis, a late traveler making quickly for shelter, a lantern swinging low in one hand. But such figures are rare now, and they move with a purpose that wants no conversation. The night watch has its rounds to make, men with their torches and their slow, heavy steps, checking that fires are properly banked, that no light burns unattended behind a shutter. They call out the hour occasionally, or simply move in silence, which is its own kind of announcement. The curfew has long been in effect. The word itself carries within it the old French couvre-feu, cover the fire. And all across the city, fires have been covered. In the bakehouses, the great ovens have been banked down for the night, their heat sealed inside them, conserved for the morning when the fires will be raked back to life, and the first bread of a new day will be set to prove. The oven walls hold their warmth for many hours, and if you stood near one now, in the quiet dark of a sleeping bakehouse, you would feel it radiating outward like something gentle and patient, a sleeping warmth, unhurried. In the cookshops and the taverns, the last customers have gone. Trestles have been cleared and stacked against the walls. The rushes on the floor will stay until morning. A cat moves through one of these rooms now, stepping carefully around the scattered bones and bits of fallen bread, attending to its own quiet business entirely. The river is very dark. The Seine runs black between its banks, reflecting nothing tonight, or very little, perhaps a sliver of something from a lantern left burning somewhere on one of the bridges. A long pale streak on the water, trembling slightly as the current moves beneath it. The bridges themselves, the Pont Notre Dame, the Grand Pont, the others, are quiet now. The shops built along them are all shuttered and dark. The bridge dwellers have gone inside. The millers' boats moored beneath the Grand Pont rock very gently in the current, their wheels still for the night, their ropes creaking softly with each small movement of the water. Along the quays, the larger boats are tied and resting. The cargo that arrived today, barrels of wine from upstream, bundles of cloth, great piles of firewood stacked on the bank. All of it is still, waiting for tomorrow. A rope here, an anchor there, the ordinary small fastenings that hold things in place through the dark hours. A rat moves along the quayside, pauses, moves on. The smell of the river at night is cool and a little green, mixed now with the wood smoke that drifts down from the sleeping city above the banks, and with the faintest trace of the day's commerce, fish and grain, and the river mud that always underlies everything here. The city breathes. That is not a fanciful thing to say. A medieval city of this size, perhaps 80,000 people living within and just around its walls, does breathe, in a certain sense. It exhales the warmth of its gathered bodies, the heat of its fires, the slow exhalation of breath from all those sleeping rooms. In winter, this warmth is more noticeable. The way a city will hold its collected heat a little longer than the open countryside around it. But even in other seasons, there is something, a density, a presence, a warmth that belongs to concentrated human life. And tonight that life is almost entirely horizontal. In the narrow houses along the Rue de la Harpe and the Rue des Lombards and the thousand other streets whose names map the particular trades and origins of those who settled them, people are sleeping on straw pallets, on wool-stuffed mattresses for those who have them, under blankets of rough linen or coarser wool, curled close together for warmth. Husband and wife, children between them, or on their own pallet nearby, the whole household breathing in its slow, collective rhythm. A candle has guttered out somewhere in an upstairs room. The last small thread of smoke rises from its wick and vanishes into the dark. In the great houses closer to the Isle de la Cité, the sleeping arrangements are more elaborate, but the sleep itself is the same deep, dark, uncomplicated sleep that comes after a long day of physical work and early hours. The wealthy have curtained beds, heavy cloth hanging from rings to keep the drafts away, and they sleep behind those curtains in a kind of portable room within a room. But the dreams, perhaps, are not so different. In the churches, the monks who have finished Compline have gone to their dormitories. They will rise again before dawn for the night office, matins, and then lauds at first light. The cycle does not stop simply because it is dark. But for now there is quiet even in the cloisters, the stone passages empty, the cloister garth open to the sky, and whatever stars there are tonight. On the Isle de la Cité, the Cathedral of Notre Dame stands in its own large darkness. The great west facade, with its carved figures in their shallow arches, faces the last of the light. But there is no light now, only the shapes of things barely visible against a slightly lighter sky. The rose window is dark. The towers, still incomplete in this century, their scaffolding removed and restored so many times now, rise up into the night without expression. The river moves around the island on both sides, the north branch and the south, carrying its cold, dark water past the stone foundations, as it has done for longer than the cathedral has stood here, longer than any building that stands here now. The sound of the last Compline bell has long since faded. There may be another hour before the bell ringers sleep. There may be a watchman still moving along a far section of the city walls, his torch held low. There may be a woman in some side street, sitting up with a sick child, keeping very still, watching the child's face in the candlelight. These things are happening, or something like them is happening, somewhere in the darkness of this large sleeping city, because a city of this size always holds some wakefulness within it, even in its deepest hours. But the body of the city sleeps. The bakehouse fires sleep in their sealed ovens. The river runs on without hurry. The boats shift gently at their moorings. The bridges hold their emptiness. The stone walls hold their cold. The straw in 1,000 houses holds the weight and warmth of sleeping bodies. The cats do their quiet work. The night settles over everything like something patient and very old. A darkness that has come here every night without fail, that knows these particular rooftops and these particular angles of river and bridge and tower, that covers everything with the same unhurried care. And in the morning the fire will be raked out, the first bell will ring, the bread will be made, the boats will untie, the whole long ordinary day will begin again. But that is the morning. For now there is only this: the warm, dark weight of the city at rest, the river below the bridges, the slow, even breathing of 80,000 sleeping lives, each one contained within its own small darkness, its own particular roof, its own particular quietness, all of them together making one great collective stillness, at the center of which there is nothing more to do, nothing more to say, nothing more to want. Only this, only rest